fraud comes in many, many different forms. So just set us up in like all the different ways we should be thinking about fraud.
In all the years I've been investigating fraud in law enforcement, it wasn't necessarily about financial loss. It was using deceit to advance some objective with the final goal of perhaps monetary or an intelligence gathering gain.
Every role that I've ever been in, I've worked really closely with the fraud teams. Security and fraud are kind of the head and tail of the snake, right? And I'm not going to say which is the head and which is the tail, but we definitely work together to make this animal move forward.
Craig Herder wants to know, what is a proven method for addressing fraud from a joint cyber fraud task force perspective?
Early communication is always really important. If everybody knows what's going on right up front, that helps a ton. What's really worked well for me in the past has been a task force. We get people in the same room.
I would add that you also want to be proactive about a relationship with law enforcement. You don't want to wait until you're compromised.
This one from Adam. Is there ever a case where you see fraud where you're like, this doesn't seem so damaging, let's move on? Or do you investigate every case?
As a vendor, we're like a zero tolerance for fraud. We don't want to see any fraud, but that's true. You go to some enterprises and they have a certain threshold, and as long as it's below that threshold, then they're not going to throw any additional resources at it.
Chargeback fraud is a really good example of that. If chargeback fraud was under a certain threshold, it wasn't worth the time or the energy or the money because you know exactly what's going on there and you can fight it or not, but it's going to cost you a lot.
This one from Rick Woodward. How do we overcome the perverse incentive of devices that don't suffer negative consequences being used to perpetrate fraud attacks against other organizations that will suffer consequences?
It isn't just IoT, it's cloud hosting. We tried reaching out to some of these organizations and they just have no appetite at all to putting an end to it because they're making money from it.
This is beat the bad idea. Accept all fraud and just write it off against your taxes. How are you going to beat this bad idea, Matt?
I guess you hire an army of lawyers. You bog the process down. You're not achieving the goal, but you're beating the fraud.
Partner with Reddit to mess with your stock price because with no corporate value, there is nothing for fraudsters to gain. How are you going to beat this bad idea?
The best way, honestly, to go about that is through velocity monitoring. What's a typical trading volume for our company? What's our average trading volume? And I think implementing an internal circuit breaker behind that would be the way that I would go about doing that. Right?
This from Oanati. How difficult is it to quantify a return in investment in fraud departments?
It's like, how do you prove a negative? How do you prove the value of something that didn't happen? What we like to talk about instead is how we have moved the needle to actual risk prevention and risk reduction.
What's also hard to quantify is damage to brand. If there's a negative headline, what does that mean for an enterprise? Is it tens of millions, hundreds of millions in losses? It's hard to quantify, but it's something that every enterprise is concerned about.
There's Sean Bowen. He's got our two what's worse scenarios.
We have decriminalize fraud and use it as your bug bounty program, or legalize fraud, then tax it at the current tax income rate, and then send the revenue back to those who are defrauded.
Well, the second one kind of totally reminded me of the marijuana legalization initiatives we had in California a few years back, right? That was the idea. So that's probably the better of the two ideas. The worst of the two ideas is for sure the first one.
Here comes an interesting question from Mike Welch, who's the CISO over at Security Scorecard. If we implemented strong anti-money laundering controls and monitoring globally, what percentage of banks would go out of business as a result?
I think quite a few of them might struggle. I do think that a lot of the banks are being used aggressively for money laundering. Based on my interaction with them, they all seem to be making a sincere effort at preventing it. It's just, it's a tough problem to solve.
This question from Sandeep Campbell. He asks, how do you calculate the total cost of fraud?
It's a really difficult thing to track, David. You're always looking at percentages. So if my overall percentage of fraud is, I don't know, we'll make up something 4%. And if all of a sudden we have a really good quarter and our transaction volume doubles, but my fraud volume goes up to 16%, that's a problem.
And oftentimes when you discover fraud, it's something that took place 6 months ago and you didn't know it at the time. So understanding the timing of the fraud and when it actually occurred can be a challenge as well.
And this comes from Rick Woodward. We often seem to be chasing the latest new schemes. Is there a systemic way to prevent fraud methods that haven't been seen in a while?
I don't think it's a predictable pattern. There is a pattern, but it reveals itself kind of retrospectively. You look back at it and you see the pattern. Anytime I've heard a so-called expert predict what fraud is going to happen the next year, it's either too vague to be useful or they're inaccurate.
That's a difficult situation for us. But what we do know is that there's a pattern of normal. And we know that anything outside of that pattern of normal should be viewed with a certain amount of suspicion.
If you're part of the overall scheme, then you should take an interest in preventing it. Sadly, right now, it's only the enterprise that incurs a financial loss that is left to battle that, and nobody else is helping. If we all work more closely together, we'll have a much better shot at preventing fraud going forward, or at least reducing it.
You can reduce the incidence of fraud, but what we really have to focus on is reducing the value to the fraudster. Ultimately, the dream would be the fraudster is like, Geraldo Rivera opening Al Capone's vault, right? There's nothing there once they get to the end of this journey. You make it really expensive for them, and then there's no reward at the end. They're going to go find richer patchers because fraudsters are lazy by nature.